I was not there for the beginning of it. That is the first thing I must tell you, because people who hear this story always assume I was, that I stood in the corner of my uncle's drawing room and watched Myra fold her hands in her lap and listen to the Duchess of Ashenvale explain, in the most civil language imaginable, that she was nobody and should go. I was not there. I was in Ludwich that week, dealing with a surveyor's dispute that had kept my uncle's firm occupied for the better part of a month, and by the time I returned to Ashenvale, Myra was already gone. My uncle told me about it the evening I came back, sitting across from me at the supper table with the candle between us guttering in a draught from the hall. He was a careful man, my Uncle Amos Ashwell, solicitor, a man who had measured words the way a jeweler measures weight, never spending more than necessary, and even he had no careful way to put it. He said, "The Duchess sent for Myra on Tuesday. Myra left Wednesday before dawn. She has taken the coach to Breadmore and sent word that she is well." I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "And Ashenvale?" My uncle looked at the candle. "The Duke has not called." That was the whole of it as far as the village knew. The Duchess had spoken. Myra had listened. Myra had gone. The Duke, Edmund Cale, 4th Duke of Ashenvale, feared in the county, respected in London, a man whose opinion on any question carried the weight of a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward whether he wished it or not, had said nothing, had done nothing, had let the silence stretch from Tuesday to Wednesday to a week to a month, and the month had become the shape of what he was. I had known Myra since she was 12 years old and I was 17, when her father died of a fever that swept through the mill district and left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a name that my uncle, who had been her father's closest friend, decided mattered enough to keep. He took her in. He gave her a room at the back of the house and a seat at his table and a position in his household that was something between ward and assistant, never quite either. Myra had made it entirely her own. By the time she was 18, she was keeping his correspondence. By 20, she was managing his accounts. By 22, she understood the law better than 2 of his junior clerks, though she was not permitted to say so aloud, and she never did. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped rooms. She was something better. She was the kind of woman who, once you had truly looked at her, made it difficult to look anywhere else. There was a quality of attention in her, a stillness when she listened that made the person speaking feel, perhaps for the first time in their life, that what they were saying actually mattered. She had dark hair she wore simply, a gray dress she wore constantly, and a way of sitting in a chair that managed to be both entirely proper and entirely at ease. My uncle said once, when he had taken a glass of port and was therefore briefly honest, that Myra Ashwell had more natural authority than anyone he had met in 40 years of law. He said it quietly, as though it were a secret, and perhaps it was. Edmund Cale had first encountered her in my uncle's study, of all places. He had come to consult on a matter of tenancy law, some dispute with a farmer at the eastern edge of the Ashenvale lands, and my uncle had been called away for an hour, and Myra had been left to receive the Duke and explain the delay. I was not present for this either. What I know I have assembled from what Myra told me in pieces over the years that followed, and from what the Duke himself told me much later, when he was past the point of pride and willing to be accurate. He had walked in expecting to wait in silence. Myra had offered him tea and asked a single, precise question about the Eastern tenancy, something that had struck her as legally unusual when she had filed the correspondence, and Edmund Cale had found himself answering it, then answering another. Then sitting forward in the chair he had settled into with the careless posture of a man who did not expect to be interested in anything, and becoming interested. He stayed for 2 hours. My uncle never returned before they were done. After that he came back, not to the study after the first time, to the house, to the drawing room in the evenings when my uncle received callers. He came on Tuesdays and sometimes on Thursdays. He sat in the high-backed chair near the window, and Myra sat across from him, and they talked, not about the tenancy, about everything else, about the law and what it missed, about the county and what it needed, about books he had read and books she had read and books neither of them had read yet but intended to. He was, she told me once, the most genuinely curious person she had ever met, curious in the way that a man is curious when no one has ever expected him to perform curiosity, so that it remains the real thing, untouched by display. She was careful. I should tell you she was careful. She did not deceive herself about what she was, the ward of a village solicitor, a woman with no family name worth speaking and no fortune worth counting, in a county governed by a family that had held its title for 200 years. She was careful, but she was also 23 and he was 30, and the conversations had gone on for 7 months, and there is a limit to what care can do when it is up against that. The village noticed, of course. Villages always notice. There was talk, the precise, genteel kind of talk that Ashenvale specialized in, which managed to be both absolutely accurate and absolutely deniable. The Duchess noticed. She was a woman of 60 who had spent her entire adult life ensuring that the Kale family made only profitable decisions, and she had a very clear view of what Myra Ashwell was and what she was not. She sent for Myra on a Tuesday morning, not an evening, a morning, so that there could be no ambiguity about whether this was a social call, and received her in the formal sitting room, which she had decorated to ensure that anyone who entered it understood immediately that they were at a disadvantage. What she said, Myra told me years later, was not unkind. That was the thing Myra always insisted on, that the Duchess had not been unkind. She had been precise. She had explained in 3 or 4 paragraphs of elegant speech that her son admired Miss Ashwell greatly, that this admiration was to his credit, that Miss Ashwell herself was clearly a woman of intelligence and character, and that none of this changed the fundamental situation, which was that the Duke of Ashenvale would not be permitted to form an attachment to a solicitor's ward with no name and no money. The county would not bear it. The family would not survive it. Myra would not wish, surely, to be the cause of harm to a man she clearly held in some regard. Myra had said very little. She had asked one question, which was whether the Duke was aware of this conversation. The Duchess had paused for slightly too long, and then said that the Duke's feelings were not relevant to the practical matter at hand. Myra had understood in that pause everything she needed to know. She had thanked the Duchess. She had curtsied a deep, perfect curtsy, the kind that said nothing and meant everything. She had walked out of the formal sitting room, down the long corridor, and out the front door of Ashenvale House, and she had not looked back at it. She was gone before dawn the next morning. She left a note for my uncle, brief and specific. She was going to Breadmer, where she had a letter of introduction to a firm that had once consulted my uncle's practice on a cross-county matter. She was well. She was grateful. She would write when she was settled. She did not leave a note for the Duke. She did not, as far as I ever determined, consider it. But what happened to Edmund Kale in the weeks after she left is something I witnessed, and I find I am not able to be entirely without feeling about it, even now. He came to my uncle's house on the Thursday, his usual Thursday, and I happened to be in the hall when he arrived. I had come back from Ludwich to find Myra gone and had spent 2 days in a state of very controlled fury on her behalf, and I was not, I will admit, disposed to be generous with the Duke of Ashenvale. He was wearing his usual dark coat, his usual expression of contained authority, and he looked, when my uncle's housekeeper opened the door, like a man who had come expecting things to be exactly as they had been, and who had walked instead into a room where everything had been moved 2 inches to the left, so that nothing was where his hands remembered it. My uncle received him. I stood in the doorway of the study, not quite in the room. I heard my uncle explain in the careful voice he used for difficult clients that Myra had gone to Breadmer, that she had made the decision herself, that she had left a note, that she was well. I heard the Duke ask once where in Breadmer. My uncle said he did not think that information was his to give. There was a long silence. The Duke said quietly that he understood and thanked my uncle for his time and left. He did not come back on the following Tuesday. He did not come back at all that autumn. What I heard, through the ordinary channels of a county that watched its principal family the way a farmer watches the weather, was that the Duchess had presented him with a candidate before the winter was out, a young woman from a very old Hampshire family, well-connected and pretty, and entirely without the habit of asking precise legal questions. He married her in the spring. The wedding was a county event. Ashenvale House was flowers and music for a week, and the county attended and ate the food and drank the wine and said all the correct things, and the Duke stood at the altar and said his vows in the voice he used for public occasions, which was not his real voice, and I did not attend, because I had gone to visit Myra in Breadmer, and I thought that was a better use of my time. I found her in good order. That is the only way I know to put it. She was lodging in a set of rooms above a bookshop, and she had already established herself with the firm whose letter of introduction she had carried, and she had already, in the 4 months since she had left Ashenvale, become the sort of woman that people in Breadmer spoke of as indispensable. She was thinner. She was also somehow more herself, as though the weight of hope, of careful managing, of being precise about what she was and was not allowing herself to feel, had lifted, and what remained was simply Myra. Myra without apology. Myra in a gray dress that was slightly better than her old gray dress, in a room full of books, making tea with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, and asking me, with genuine interest, how my uncle's Eastern tenancy matter had resolved. I stayed for a week. I told her about the Duke's visit to the house because I thought she had a right to know. She listened with the stillness I had always known in her, and when I was finished she said, "I thought he might." Then she poured more tea and asked me about Ludwich, and I understood that was the end of what she wished to say about it. I saw her 3 times a year after that when my work brought me near Breadmer. Each time, something had changed, always upward. The firm had made her a junior correspondent, then a senior one. Then she had left the firm because a widow in Breadmer, a Mrs. Holt, childless, fond of precision, possessed of a considerable estate, had found her services so useful that she had brought Myra into her household as companion and secretary, and after 2 years as something closer to an equal. When Mrs. Holt died, which she did in Myra's 6th year in Breadmer, quietly and without fuss, the will was read and it contained Myra's name. Not a small bequest, a substantial one, the kind that changes the category a woman occupies in the world's ledger. Myra wrote to me about it in a letter that was 3 paragraphs long and entirely practical. She said she was going to invest carefully and continue working. She said she had been given something and intended to use it correctly. She said she was grateful to Mrs. Holt and that she missed her. She did not say anything about what this meant for her position in the world, because she was Myra and she did not deal in what things meant, only in what they were. What they were over the next 3 years was this: enough. Enough to act. Enough to choose. And when the opportunity came, when the estate adjacent to Ashenvale, a property called Thornfield, came onto the market for the first time in 40 years, offered by a family whose debts had finally outrun their land, Myra bought it. She wrote to tell me before she did it. She was asking me to review the conveyance documents, which was entirely practical, and also, I understood, telling me something. I reviewed the documents. I told her the purchase was sound. I did not ask her why she had chosen that particular estate in that particular county, and she did not tell me. We did not need to discuss it. Some things between 2 people who have known each other for 20 years are simply understood. I was there when she arrived. She came on an October morning, when the Ashenvale lane was bright with the last of the autumn leaves, and the air had the cold clarity that sometimes descends on an English countryside and makes it look like a painting of itself. She arrived in a hired carriage. Her own was being brought up from Breadmer with the rest of her things, and I met her at the gate of Thornfield, which had been opened for the first time in a decade and smelled of old iron and damp stone. She was 36 years old. She wore a coat the color of deep water, not gray this time, something richer, and her hair was arranged differently than I remembered from her Ashenvale days, more deliberately, with the kind of care that a woman takes when she has decided to be seen. She stepped down from the carriage and looked at the gate and the avenue beyond it and the house at the far end, standing in its overgrown grounds with the October light on its windows, and she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The kitchen garden will want entirely rebuilding." I had been holding a large amount of feeling on her behalf for the entire morning, and this made me laugh, which was probably what she intended. We walked up the avenue together, and she told me what she planned to do with the grounds, and I told her what the county was saying about the new owner of Thornfield, which was a great deal, all of it curious and half of it wrong, and we were easy together in the way of people who have been easy together for 20 years. She asked precisely once whether Edmund Cale was still at Ashenvale. I told her he was. I told her his wife had died 2 years ago, a fever that had taken her before the doctor could be of use, and that he had been widowed since and had not remarried. I told her the county regarded him with a mixture of respect and faint worry, the way a county regards a man who has power and no softness left in him. He was 43. He ran his estate correctly and with total competence. He attended church. He sat on the local bench. He was, by every visible measure, entirely fine, and by every invisible measure, hollowed out. Myra listened. She asked nothing further. We went inside. The county called, as counties do. They came in the first week. The wives of the neighboring landowners, curious and cautious, bringing cakes and good intentions, and the desire to determine exactly what Myra Ashwell was, now that she had become something. She received them all in the drawing-room of Thornfield, which she had furnished simply and well, and she was exactly what she had always been, precise, warm, genuinely interested in what people said. And by the end of the first week, the county had decided it liked her very much indeed. This was not something the county had planned to decide. It was simply what happened when you gave Myra Ashwell a drawing-room and an hour of your time. Edmund Cale did not come in the first week. He came on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after she had arrived. I know this because I was still at Thornfield, having extended my visit on the reasonably honest excuse that there were several more legal details to settle, and I was in the library reviewing some correspondence when I heard the knock at the front door, and then, a few moments later, the sound of the housekeeper showing someone into the drawing-room. I stayed where I was. The visit lasted 40 minutes. I did not hear what was said. Thornfield's library is well separated from its drawing-room, and Myra had closed the door. What I heard at the end of it was the sound of footsteps in the hall, and then the front door, and then hooves on the gravel outside, and then silence. Myra came to find me in the library 20 minutes after that. She sat down in the chair across from my writing table and looked at me. I waited. She said, "He has not changed as much as I expected." I said, "In what sense?" She was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was choosing words with care. Then she said, "He is still the most genuinely curious person I have ever met." A pause. "It is still the real thing." I did not say anything. She looked at the bookshelves for a while. Then she said, "He asked if he might call again. I said he was welcome to as a neighbor." "As a neighbor," I repeated. "That is what we are," she said, and got up and went to talk to the kitchen about the garden. He called again. Of course he called again. He came on the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that, and by the third Wednesday the housekeeper had stopped announcing him in the tone reserved for callers and had begun using the tone reserved for expected guests. He brought, and this struck me, the first time I noticed it, books. Not as gifts, exactly, more as objects he had thought she might find interesting and had included in his coat pocket the way a man includes a handkerchief. One week a pamphlet on agricultural drainage that had been circulating in London. One week a volume on Roman land law that he had come across in the Ashenvale library and thought she might not have seen. Small things, precisely chosen. Myra accepted them with the same quality of attention she applied to everything. She did not lean toward him. She did not give him any of the small encouragements, a particular smile, a held gaze a beat too long, a question asked with a warmth that went beyond the words, that a woman gives a man when she wants him to know he is succeeding. She was pleasant. She was genuine. She was exactly what she had always been, and she gave him nothing beyond it. And I watched Edmund Cale, 4th Duke of Ashenvale, a man who had spent 13 years in the careful management of himself, begin to come apart at the seams so slowly that he probably did not notice it until it was too late. The county noticed, of course. The county noticed everything, and it found the whole business extremely satisfying in a quiet way, because Ashenvale had always respected its duke and been slightly afraid of his mother, and had watched Myra leave at 23 with the uncomfortable feeling that something was not quite right. And now here was Myra back and entirely her own, and here was the Duke driving over to Thornfield twice a week with pamphlets in his pocket. And there was a justice in it that the county felt in its bones without quite being able to name. The Duchess was still alive. She was 73 and lived in the dower house at the edge of the Ashenvale grounds and still received callers every Tuesday. She had called on Myra in the second week. I had been present for that one, standing at the window under the pretense of looking at the garden, and Myra had received her with the same perfect courtesy she brought to everyone, and had thanked her for coming, and had offered her excellent tea, and had asked with genuine interest about the dower house garden, which she had heard was very fine. The Duchess had left after exactly 1 hour. On the way down the front steps she had paused, and I had watched her, from the window, stand very still for a moment before she reached her carriage. I have spent a fair amount of time since then wondering what she was thinking in that pause. I suspect she was understanding, with the clarity that sometimes comes to very intelligent people when it is too late to be useful, exactly what she had done 13 years before in that formal sitting room. What she had cost her son, and what it had made of Myra, and whether those two things were separable. I believe she understood them perfectly. I also believe there was nothing she could do about it, and that she knew that too. It was in December, 10 weeks after Myra had come to Thornfield, that I was present for the conversation that mattered. We were in the walled garden at the back of the house, which Myra was in the process of restoring. The kitchen garden she had assessed on her first morning was taking shape, new beds dug, old stone walls repointed, a vine trained back against the south-facing wall that she said would be excellent by the following summer. The December light was thin and very clean. The air smelled of turned earth and cold stone. Myra was examining the south wall, and I was being nominally useful by holding a length of twine, and Edmund Cale was standing 6 feet away looking at the vine. He had arrived unannounced, which was new. He had come through the side gate, which he had learned led directly to the garden, and found us there, and Myra had said with no surprise that he was welcome to walk with us if he liked. He had been walking with us for 20 minutes in a silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, the silence of a man who has come with something to say and has not yet found the words for it. Then he said without preamble, "I owe you an apology." Myra looked at the vine. She did not look at him. She said, "For what specifically?" I recognized this as a thing she did, not unkind, not a test, genuinely requiring specificity. She had never in her life accepted the general when the particular was available. Edmund Cale said, "For saying nothing." He said it as though he had been carrying those 3 words for 13 years, and had finally put them down. There was a quality in his voice I had not heard from him before, not the voice he used for public occasions, not the careful voice of competence and authority, but something that had been underneath that for a very long time and had not been allowed out. Myra was quiet. The wind moved through the vine on the wall. Then she said, "I know." He said, "I should have spoken to my mother before she spoke to you. I knew what she intended. I told myself I was allowing her to, that it was kinder, that it was more civilized, that you would prefer." He stopped. None of that was the truth. The truth was that I did not have the courage. I was afraid of what saying it aloud would cost me, and instead I let it cost you. Myra turned from the wall then and looked at him. It was the first time in 10 weeks I had seen her look at him directly, the full quality of her attention, the same thing that had made him stay for 2 hours in my uncle's study 13 years ago. He did not look away from it. I think, perhaps, it was the first genuinely honest moment he had allowed himself since she had left. She said, "What are you asking for, Edmund?" He said, "I'm not sure I am in a position to ask for anything." He looked at the garden, at the new beds and the pointed stone and the south-facing vine. He looked at Thornfield behind us, its restored windows, its freshly painted door, its air of competent habitation. He looked at Myra. "I am aware that you have built something here that has nothing to do with me. I would not want you to think that I am arriving to ask you to rebuild it around me instead." Myra said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What would you want if you were in a position to want something?" He said, "To be your neighbor, to bring you pamphlets about drainage, to sit in your drawing room on Wednesday mornings and talk about books we have not yet read." A pause. "To earn, over time, the right to ask whether there is anything further you might permit." It was as precisely honest as anything I had ever heard him say. I stood holding my length of twine and tried to be invisible, which was unnecessary because neither of them was looking at me. Myra was quiet for a long moment. The December light moved across the garden. Then she said, "The vine will need tying back in the spring. It will be a considerable amount of work." Edmund Cale looked at the vine. He said, "I know something about vines." Myra said, "Then you may come and help with it if you like." She turned back to the south wall. He moved to stand beside her, a careful distance away, and looked at the vine with the focused attention of a man who has been given something small and intends to treat it as though it is the most important thing he has ever been trusted with. Because it was. Because he knew it was. I coiled the twine and found somewhere else to be for a while. I will tell you what the county saw in the 2 years that followed, because the county's version and the true version are, in this case, nearly the same thing, and the county had waited a long time to see it. They saw the Duke of Ashenvale at Thornfield on Wednesday mornings, and then on Saturday afternoons, and then often on Tuesdays as well, driving over with something in his coat pocket and staying longer each time. They saw Myra at the Ashenvale Assembly in January, not as a guest of the Duke, exactly, not yet, but present, in a dress the color of deep water, talking to people with the quality of attention that people remembered for weeks afterward. They saw the kitchen garden at Thornfield, which had been bare earth in October, become something extraordinary by the following summer, tended by a woman who knew what she was doing, and a Duke who had discovered, apparently, that he found agricultural work considerably more interesting than he had previously given it credit for. They saw what it was. It was careful. It was earned. It was not the rush of a man claiming a woman for an audience, not the public declaration in front of 400 people, not anything that announced itself at all. It was Wednesday mornings and winter bare vines and 2 people in a garden learning, at a pace Myra set and Edmund matched, what they were allowed to be to each other. The Duchess said nothing about it publicly. What she said to her son in private I do not know and was not told. I know only that she attended the quiet dinner Myra gave the following November, 8 people, the dining room at Thornfield, good food and excellent wine, and a conversation that lasted until nearly midnight, and that she sat at the table and talked to Myra with the exact quality of attention that her son brought to things he considered worth his time. Whether it was an apology or simply an acknowledgement, I cannot say. It was there. Myra accepted it exactly as she had accepted the dismissal 13 years before, with perfect courtesy, and a curtsy at the end of the evening, and no performance in either direction. They were married in the April, a small wedding, 40 people, the village church at the edge of the Thornfield grounds, spring light and the first flowers of the kitchen garden in the arrangements, which Myra had specified herself. I stood on Edmund's left and watched him look at her when she came through the door, the specific look of a man who has spent a very long time understanding exactly what he almost lost, and has not, for a single day of the past 2 years, forgotten it. She walked toward him without hurrying. She had waited 36 years to walk toward something that was entirely her own choosing, and she was not going to hurry it now. When she reached him, he took her hand. It was not a possessive gesture. It was something closer to the opposite of that, the gesture of a man receiving something he does not entirely believe he has been granted and intending to hold it very carefully. She looked at him. He looked at her. The vicar said the words and they said the words back, quietly and without performance, and the 40 people in the church understood that what they were witnessing was not a ceremony so much as a conclusion. The last line of a very long sentence that had been begun in my uncle's study, and had been interrupted for 13 years, and was only now, at last, arriving where it had always been going. I cried, which I had not expected to do, being a man of generally practical temperament. My uncle, who was 81 and sat in the front pew, cried without any self-consciousness at all, and I thought it was probably the most honest thing I had ever seen him do. Myra did not cry. She was entirely composed, entirely present, entirely herself, the woman who had curtsied and left and built a life that needed no one's permission. She said her vows in the clear voice she used when she meant something, which was always, and she did not look anywhere but at the man in front of her. After it was over, after the church and the small dinner in the garden in the April light, after the last guests had gone and the house had gone quiet, I found her in the walled garden as I had known I would. She was standing near the south wall, looking at the vine, which had come into leaf and was exactly as excellent as she had said it would be. I stood beside her for a while without speaking. Then I said, because I had been wanting to say it for 13 years, "You did not have to come back here. You knew that." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I know. You built something in Breadmer that was entirely your own. You could have stayed." "Yes," she said, "I could have." I waited. The April wind moved through the garden. She looked at the vine. "I came back," she said at last, "because I wanted to, not because he deserved it, not because anyone was waiting for me, because I had built enough of a life that I could choose what to add to it." She paused. "That is the only reason I would have accepted, for any of it." I thought about that. About a woman of 23 who had curtsied in a formal sitting room and walked out of a house and built something that no one could take from her, and then chosen, from strength and not from need, to walk back in. About what it means to arrive somewhere not because you have been summoned but because you have decided. I said, "Your father would have been very proud of you." She did not say anything for a long time. The garden was very quiet. The vine was catching the last of the April light. Then she said, "He would have liked the garden." And that, I think, is where this story ends. Not in the church, not in the public moment, but here, in the walled garden in April, with the vine coming right at last, and Myra looking at it with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has grown something entirely her own, and decided on her own terms what else she would like to grow alongside it. The Duke found us there a few minutes later. He stood at the gate of the walled garden and looked in, and saw Myra, and the look on his face was the same one he had worn in the church, that specific look of a man who knows exactly what he holds and intends never again to let go. He came through the gate and stood beside her, close and careful, and she did not move away, and the April light came down over all of it, the vine, the new beds, the pointed stone, the two of them, and settled there. There is nothing further to tell.